Hi, everybody. Happy 2022. Welcome to our first Comet Talk of the year, of the new year. And it's almost like we knew that we were going to be in a situation where gathering in groups again was going to be funky, because we incidentally have a speaker tonight who's with us from Alabama, which means we have to do it as a Zoom webinar. So this worked out really well. It's like we knew we had to plan ahead. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Megan Remington. I am our Community Education Coordinator here at Coconino Community College. And this is what I get to do all the time. It's super fun. After the webinar is over, you're going to get directed to a survey. I hope you'll complete it for us super fast and let us know what you want to learn next, what classes we can provide, what kind of community programming you're looking for, all that good stuff. If you've never been on a webinar before, which I highly doubt at this point in these times, but if you haven't, or if you're unfamiliar, make sure you put your questions in the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen here. And when you do that, we'll be monitoring it. If we have the opportunity to answer questions as we go, we will do that. But otherwise, there will be about 10 minutes at the very end where we'll address questions from folks. So I'll be in the background. If I have the opportunity to pop your question in there, I will. But just know that if you ask a question, it will get addressed. And with that, I am actually going to pass this over to our very own Dr. Hernando, who's going to be facilitating this conversation with Dr. Ball, and he's going to kick us off. So go right ahead.
Greetings, Coconino Community College. Joining us this evening is Dr. Blake Scott Ball. Dr. Ball is Assistant Professor of History and also Chair of the Department of History and Political Science at Huntington College. He received his doctorate in history from the University of Alabama, which as an LSU man myself is the only bad thing that I can say about him. Although I'm not gonna rib him too much for that, given that I'm sure he's still recovering from the recent mishap against Georgia. His dissertation on peanuts and politics was awarded Outstanding Dissertation of 2017 by both the College of Arts and Sciences and the Graduate School at the University of Alabama. And if that weren't enough, in 2021, he published his first book, Charlie Brown's America, The Popular Politics of Peanuts, which is, of course, based on his dissertation with Oxford University Press. He published his first book with Oxford University Press, which in our line of work is a little bit like going from the mobile home to the penthouse on Fifth Avenue. Yeah, it's pretty darn impressive. He lives in Prattville, Alabama, with his wife and 3 daughters. Dr. Ball, thank you so much for being here with us.
Dr. Hernando, thank you. It's good to see you. We'll have to go easy on the Alabama football references right now. We're still in mourning down here.
I'm sure, but don't worry. If St. Nick's track record is any indication, you'll be back in the playoffs next year. Can't say the same for my beloved Tigers. I think it'll be a while.
Maybe it's looking at it.
Yeah. So I'll jump right into our questions. One of the central concepts that you introduce in this book is that of polysemy. Can you explain for the audience what polysemy is, and why was Schultz's use of polysemy so essential to his success?
Well, that's a great question. In fact, that's a word that when I was writing this book, I had no idea what it was. Some colleagues and fellow scholars in comic studies kind of guided me to that. What this term means is a sort of text or a picture or an image, a symbol that has multiple possible meanings. And oftentimes these meanings depend on who is reading. sometimes we might read this in the case of like a political cartoon. Sometimes we might read this as vagueness because we can't tell. Well, is he making the point against the Democrats or for the Democrats? Which way is this which way am I supposed to read this? So it can lead to some maybe some ambiguity in the reading. But for Charles Schulz, what it meant was, he was writing Peanuts starting in October 1950. He is writing at a time where national media is not nearly as sort of fractured into little niches as it is today, where kind of everyone gets their own news network or news website or what have you. And so the goal of media at this point in mid-century was not to aim at one very distinct subset of readers, but instead to reach the broadest possible audience. So being very good at writing cartoons that could be read for meaning for a child, read for a different meaning for adults, be read for a certain meaning for a more liberal-minded person, and a different but also useful meaning for a conservative-minded person. All of these different layers and possibilities in the way that he wrote helped to expand the appeal of Peanuts. It really, in a sense, had something to say to everyone.
One of the interesting things I discovered on reading this book is that Schulz himself didn't invent the title Peanuts. And in fact, he kind of intensely disliked it. Where did that title come from? And was he right to dislike it, in your opinion?
Well, Charles Schulz was from St. Paul, Minnesota. And the day that he went to the offices of United Features Syndicate in uptown Manhattan was his first time ever visiting New York City. And it seems that it was kind of overwhelming to him, pretty exciting. He goes into these offices, and by the time he gets there, they're already sort of passing around his work and talking about how much they enjoy it. They usher him into the president's office, and they start talking about the terms of a deal. So all of this is happening very quickly. The name that Schulz had put on it was one from a similar strip that he'd been doing in St. Paul. He called it Little Folks. And so that was the original title that the strip was going to go with. Well, a couple months before they are up and running, so this kind of a little bit before October 1950, they get a letter from a lawyer representing an artist with a different syndicate that says, hey, we saw the ads. They'd started placing ads in newspapers. This new strip is coming, kind of gin up interest. We saw your ads. You can't use that title because our artist has a very similar title. And that strip wasn't currently running, but there was plans to possibly bring it back. So that it basically was a cease and desist. And so the way that United Feature Syndicate decided to handle this, instead of calling up Charles Schulz on the phone and getting a backup idea, they sort of put it to a straw poll around the office and said, okay, let's come up with 10 different titles for a strip about tiny children that are as smart as adults, so, kind of wisecracking kids. And okay, we come up with all these different, and the one that they decided on in the office was Peanuts, kind of deriving from the Peanut Gallery of the popular kids show at the time, Howdy Doody. And so they went with that. Now, Charles Schulz took great offense at this. I think one, because he didn't have a say. But two, he said, it's just an incredibly incredibly insulting title to be given to your life's work, to call your life's work Peanuts, you know. And so one way that you can sort of see him getting back at the editors sometimes was on the Sunday strips. You'd get this extra sort of title panel at the top, and oftentimes Schultz would do these very elaborate, interesting, unique drawings at the top, and it would give the title, and in reasonably sized font it would say Peanuts, and then it would say featuring, and then in the biggest font of all it would say good old Charlie Brown, because one of the other things that frustrated him about the name was people would constantly write and say, hey, I'm loving the new strip, but which kid is Peanut? And they thought that was one of the characters' names. So he hated that name to no end.
Obviously, most of Peanuts' epic half-century run occurs against the backdrop of the Cold War. What does Schultz have to say about such topics as war and also nuclear weapons, which obviously were a very pertinent issue during that time frame? And how does one of Schultz's most beloved characters, Snoopy, how does he tie into Schultz's commentary on those topics?
Well, you know, in a lot of ways, Peanuts, if you go back today and you read Peanuts in the 1950s, you get something quite different from what many of us have come to know Peanuts as, which is what it had become by that 1965 Christmas special. Right? The art had kind of developed to the point to where that was going to kind of carry on through the end, and the personalities of the characters had developed to that point. In some ways, the 1950 strips were much more bleak and sometimes dark humored. You would get strips like, for instance, in one case, Charlie Brown, early on in the run, Charlie Brown is home alone. He walks over to the telephone, picks it up, says, hello, operator. Could you tell me a story, please? I'm lonely. Or another one where Charlie Brown and Linus are standing outside and looking at the stars, and the sort of perspective is from behind them, and you see the starry sky, and it's just silence for 3 panels. And then the 4th panel, Charlie Brown says, okay, can we go back inside and watch TV now? I'm beginning to feel insignificant. So there was this real sort of wry, at times a bit dark humor, but existential sort of feel to the 1950s strip. Some ways the Cold War came in very blatantly. We see it, for example, in a strip where Charlie Brown and Lucy are playing H-bomb test in the mid 50s, around the Bikini Atoll test, and Lucy is voicing the explosion of the bomb. So she's, you know, kind of rattling the windows with her voice. In another case, Linus, who was one of the younger characters, the little brother of Lucy, Linus goes outside for one of his first winters since he's learned to walk. He's all bundled up. He goes walking. As he's walking, he starts to see these flakes falling, and he panics. He turns around, he runs back to the house, and on the way to the house, he runs into Charlie Brown. He says, Charlie Brown, hurry, it's happening. And Charlie Brown says, of course it's happening. It's the first snow of winter. And Linus says, oh, snow. Oh, thank goodness. I was afraid it was that fallout everybody keeps talking about. Right. And so there was this way of, again, not really commenting on whether or not it should be or shouldn't be, or who should control these things or anything like that, but a sort of acknowledgement that this has become such a normal part of life in the 1950s, that even preschool children are concerned and anxious about these realities the parents are talking about. I think one way to get at how Snoopy plays into this, as I was reflecting on this earlier, I remembered a kind of odd strip from again early in the Peanuts run, where it was a several day story, where at the time Snoopy's doghouse was right up against Charlie Brown's house instead of kind of being out in the yard like we typically see it later. And there was an icicle. There was a large icicle overhanging from the eaves of the house, and there's this multi-day sequence of Snoopy having this sort of doomed crisis of thinking, "Oh no, what happens if the icicle drops on me? What will I do? What will I do? Should I run? I'm too frightened to run." These sort of things. Finally, he does. I think the thing that gets him to get out of the way is Charlie Brown brings out the dinner dish, and he runs to the dinner dish, and the icicle falls. But that sense of dread and doom, even played for humor, is playing off of the very real sense of dread and doom, concern that was making the headlines on the front page of the same newspapers. So it's really infiltrated the humor of Peanuts in the 1950s for sure.
One of the more controversial topics that Schultz addresses in Peanuts is race relations, and also particularly early in its run, the civil rights movement. What does Schultz have to say about these topics, and how does he say it, and what new and innovative character did he introduce to help him say that?
That was a lovely setup. Thank you, Dr. Hernando. So thinking again about sort of the mass media broad audience aim of entertainment and of the 1960s, late 50s, 1960s. There was this weird thing that was happening in American entertainment by the mid 60s, and in fact, if you go back and you look at Sidney Poitier, who just passed away recently, who was one of the not only one of the early, but also one of the only at the time Black leading actors in media at the time. But you look at their reflections, and one of the things they talk about is that mid 60s, a weird thing had happened where the entertainment producers, whether they be artists or editors or TV producers or movie producers, they had realized that some of the old stereotypical Black characters had become problematic. They've become controversial and offensive. Now, of course, this is the white audience realizing this, right? Of course, Black audience had known this. It had always been offensive. But those things had become offensive, so they had sort of removed those characters from new entertainment. But there was this sort of uncertainty, almost a reluctance to bring in new representation of Black characters, because there was real concern about, well, what if the new thing we introduce is equally offensive, right? Maybe it comes across offensive or soft pedaling or something like this. And so you get this weird situation where in the mid 1960s, you watch a show like Lassie on television, and you get the sense that that there's no Black people in Lassie's world, because there are not even in background characters. They just are not there. And so in this context, Charles Schulz in the spring of 1968 gets a letter from a young mom in Southern California by the name of Harriet Glickman. And Harriet Glickman has she had been a teacher up to this point, but she decided to stay home with her children. She took some years off from teaching. And while she was home with the children, she's paying more attention to the entertainment that the children are consuming. And she's realizing, hey, this so much of what they're seeing on television or reading in the comics page doesn't reflect the world they actually are living in, right? Where there are Black children, there are Latino children, there are Asian children, and she was not seeing these reflected in media. And so she had begun writing actually to several different networks and to other artists, asking, would you please take the step to introduce Black characters into your entertainment? So one of those that she wrote to was Charles Schulz. She's writing right in the weeks after Martin Luther King was assassinated in April of 1968. So it's already a very sensitive moment. Obviously, these things were on everyone's mind and all across the news. Charles Schulz replies to the letter and says, you know, I agree with you 100% that our entertainment needs to be more diverse. It needs to represent more of America. He said, unfortunately, I don't feel that I am the right person to write a Black character. He says, I'm afraid that if I were to write a Black character, it would come across as patronizing to the readers, that it would be offensive because it would not be a sympathetic character to their perspective. And so he said, for those reasons, I appreciate your letter, but unfortunately, I don't think that I'm the one to do this. Well, Glickman certainly picked up on the fact that Schulz was connecting with her concern, and so she decides to not to take no for an answer, and instead to see if she can find a way to persuade him to be the one to do something about it. And so she writes back again, and she says, I tell you what. She was working with a community group, a community organization that was dealing with discrimination in housing laws in Southern California, zoning laws in municipalities, and there were a number of different Black families involved that she was working with. And she said, "So, would you mind if I asked them to write you some letters about, from their perspective, what it would mean to have Charlie Brown have Black friends or Black neighbors?" And Schulz writes back and says, "You know, I think that's a great idea. Sure, I would love to read those letters." So she goes to get those letters. She ends up sending back two, and was waiting on more when in that summer, June 1968. Bobby Kennedy is assassinated in California after the primary. Just found out he'd won the California primary for the Democratic nomination for president. Bobby Kennedy had become an outspoken voice for a continued civil rights agenda in the Democratic Party, and so his death, once again, this is just sort of sending shocks through this what many had hoped would be an era of progress, and so send the letters back. Of course, in both of the letters, one is from a Black father, one is from a different family, a Black mother, writing to say it would be incredible for my children to see someone who looks like them, who identifies with them, being a friend with some of the most popular characters in America. That would do so much for their personal self-esteem, knowing that that Charlie Brown has friends who look just like me and who feel like me and come from places like me. By that point, Charles Schulz, this had been weighing on him. The events in the nation had been weighing on him as well. So when he receives these letters, he fires a letter back almost instantly. Very brief letter, but he says, "Hey, keep an eye out for a Time magazine article that's going to be coming out this next week. I think you're going to be pleasantly surprised at what you find." Well, sure enough, what comes out that next week is an announcement. Charles Schulz has been in touch with his syndicate, and they have reached out to the media, and they announce that at the end of July, Charlie Brown would be getting a new friend, a new character in Peanuts, and he would be African American. And so on July 31st, 1968, Charlie Brown's on beach vacation with his sister and his mom, and he meets a boy named Franklin. Franklin was returning a volleyball or a beach ball that Charlie Brown's sister Sally had thrown out in the ocean to give him a hard time. Franklin returns the beach ball, and the two boys become sort of instant friends, talking about life and talking about their families. We find out that Franklin's dad is away serving in Vietnam, which if you look at the demographics of the time, it was disproportionately likely that African American men would find themselves drafted and sent to Vietnam in comparison to their white counterparts and other ethnic counterparts. The two build a sandcastle together. One of the things that struck me is the fact that the scene in which Charles Schulz decides to introduce this has these two boys in nothing but their swim trunks, right? Bare chest exposed. It is as clear as day that Charlie Brown is white and that Franklin is black. And yet it does not matter the slightest between the two boys. They're just children enjoying one another's company, playing together. There is no controversy with the adults that creeps into the panel. Now, and as far as the national reception goes, this was nationally celebrated in the news. Numerous outlets celebrated the introduction of Franklin. Now, Franklin does end up becoming controversial for Peanuts. That's when later the next year, Franklin moves to Charlie Brown's town, and Franklin starts going to school, and he sits in the front of the classroom, in front of Peppermint Patty, in front of Marcy, in front of the white students. He turns out to be a great student. He's a straight A student, has a great temperament. He's a good athlete on the baseball team with the other kids. But having Franklin in the classroom with other white students in 1969 and 1970 caused a big stir among newspapers in the Deep South. The syndicate began receiving letters from editors in Mississippi and in Alabama and Louisiana saying, if you haven't noticed from the news, we're still going through in 1970 a integration crisis. This is a big deal. Whole school zones are being shut down to deal with this, or to block it, or to slow it down. And so you can't be putting this into our newspapers. If Franklin continues to be in the classroom with the white students, we will pull Peanuts. Well, Charles Schulz gets a call from his editor, who is trying, it seems very gingerly, to introduce the idea of, is there any way that we could sort of modify this so that we can kind of cut down on the stir? And Charles Schulz, who was typically a pretty meek and agreeable man, he got very forceful. And he told his editor, here's the way it's going to be. Either you run these strips exactly the way that I have drawn them, or I quit. And with that, the controversy was over. They picked Schultz over the Southern newspaper editors, and Franklin stayed in the classroom.
I'm going to go a little bit off script here, because as you were answering that question, another question popped into my mind, and that is, do you think there's any significance, the setting of that first strip where Franklin appears at the beach, presumably presumably Charlie Brown and Franklin are both bathing there. Do you think there's any significance to that?
Yeah, you can. I talk about this further in one of the chapters in my book. Yeah, one of the things that that I was sort of aware of from stories from like grandparents and great grandparents. I knew that like public swimming pools had oftentimes been segregated. But one thing I learned that I was not aware of was that in many cases it wasn't just swimming pools, but it was beaches as well, and it was not just in the South that beaches were segregated. They were segregated on the Jersey Shore. They were segregated in areas in New York. Yeah, I do think that there is something. Schultz was very good at being sort of subtly profound, right? I think there is definitely a statement, because in that scene it is made very clear that just out of the panel is Franklin's mom, and just out of the panel on the other side is Charlie Brown's mom and Charlie Brown's little sister, right? But there's no controversy, there's no stir, there's no one calling the police or anything like this. It was just it was presented as if this was normal, the way the world should be. Imagine.
Aside from Charlie Brown, obviously, and also Snoopy, one of my favorite characters in the Peanuts franchise was Peppermint Patty. How does Schultz use Peppermint Patty to comment on such topics as contemporary gender roles and also women's rights?
Yeah. Peppermint Patty is a fantastic character. She has a really interesting origin. Schultz says that one day he was walking across in his studio. He had some offices where they would deal with mail and they would deal with productions and things. But his studio kind of was like this split level sort of big room. And so you could, there was this sort of den area down on the you take a couple of steps down, and there's a TV and some couches and things. And then up the steps at the back was where he had on a separate level his drawing board and all of his tools. And so he says one day he's walking down through the room there, and he bends over and on the coffee table and picks up a peppermint patty. His secretary had refilled the candies. He picks up a peppermint patty and he goes to take a bite, and he says it suddenly hits him, Peppermint Patty, that's a fantastic name for a cartoon character. And so he kind of stirs on it a little bit, and he likes it so much that he says, I better make a character and name it this quick, because if this struck me, somebody else is going to come up with this idea and have a Peppermint Patty character. So she sort of was a name in search of a character, but the character that he develops to fit this name is one of the most beautifully complex characters in Peanuts, I think. Peppermint Patty comes from a really interesting background. She is from a single parent home. Charles Schultz had five children, four children and a stepdaughter, and then in the early 70s, he and his wife had separated, and so he was dealing with this reality of. In fact, I've heard numerous stories from some of his coworkers and friends about the months that he spent. He had built a hockey arena there in Santa Rosa, California, and there was basically like a storage room up above where the ice rink was, and he had set out a couch, and for months he just slept on the couch because he couldn't go home because they were separated. He said in hindsight, the crazy thing was how difficult those years were, but yet how fruitful the creativity was in those years. In 69, 70, 71, 72, he's coming up with a lot of these characters. Well, one of those is Peppermint Patty. Peppermint Patty is she's not a great student. She's oftentimes falling asleep at in class. We get the sense that she is loved by her dad, but she doesn't get a lot of contact with her dad, and that really weighs on her. She's also hands down the best athlete in Peanuts. She dominates all of the other characters in any athletic event. She also doesn't like to dress conventionally. She wears some kind of, if we were to label them with a gender, some kind of boyish type clothes, flip-flops. And in fact, early on, she gets in trouble when the school announces a change in the dress code and that girls are going to have to wear dresses. And she protests and resists. And finally, it gets to the point to where the school forces her to wear a dress. So she wears a dress to school. It almost completely just robs her of her confidence and her sort of self-esteem. She just, you can see it's really sad, to the point to where she finally just tells her teacher off, says, send me to the principal, I don't care. Of course, she cares a little bit more once she gets sent to the principal. But she has a wonderful, I forget, Schultz kind of creates a imaginary personality for Snoopy that plays off Clarence Darrow, and she argues her constitutional rights, right, to dress as she wishes, and then she's informed that that's not actually a constitutional right, but she argues it strongly anyways. So she is always this child that's very confident in some areas, but in other areas is just kind of unsure. There's this constant ambiguous relationship that she has with Marcy. Of course, Marcy always refers to her as Sir, even though she oftentimes corrects Marcy. But Marcy has some kind of sense that this identifier is suited to who Peppermint Patty is, even though Peppermint Patty is kind of still figuring this out. Now, it was not long before Charles Schultz began to get letters and correspondence from folks who would ask about the what's up with Peppermint Patty and Marcy, what sexual orientation, what, are you trying to say something here? He adamantly denied it for years. In his mind, sexuality and sexual identity was not something that played into these characters. Nonetheless, many in Schultz's audience could identify with Peppermint Patty. They saw in her a child going through the world, not exactly fitting into the binary categories, never quite feeling comfortable with that. They identified with that, and we see in lesbian and other LGBTQ sort of community newsletters and magazines of the 70s and 80s into the 90s, where Peppermint Patty and Marcy get sort of co-opted as these symbols of gay pride, of sort of the liberation from sexual norms and binary restrictions. So much so that into today, when you find those characters in pop culture, whether it's on Saturday Night Live in reference, or it's a reference in Family Guy, or referenced in political cartoons today, you will see those characters as represented as a lesbian couple. Even though, so it's a really interesting element of, Charles Schulz was the author, and there's certainly the importance of author's intent with the creations, but his creation was so big, and it became so entwined in our culture that his audience felt safe to take possession of it. Right? We become the interpreters of what these characters mean, and so Peanuts almost through characters like Peppermint Patty takes on a new life out in the world beyond Charles Schulz.
As you make clear in Charlie Brown's America, Charles Schulz was a deeply religious man. How does an understanding of his faith understand or inform our understanding of his art in Peanuts?
Yeah, Charles Schulz was, he did not come from a particularly religious family. His family, German Americans. In fact, some of his relatives spoke German at home, at family get-togethers. They were sort of nominally Lutheran, and that's the way he had been raised. So he knew some things about the Bible and Christianity and faith, but it was just never a big part of his life. When it becomes a big part of his life is when at the age of 20, he gets a draft letter for World War II. He was always kind of an artsy kid. He was an athlete. He loved playing sports, but he had never imagined himself as being the soldier type. And so this really sort of he goes into this very anxious. He in fact, years later, he calls this the loneliest period of his life. Now, this is compounded by while he's in basic training, he gets a message one day that he needs to return to the mess hall. He gets back to the mess hall. His dad's there on the telephone crying because they were trying to get Schulz back to St. Paul fast enough to see his mother one last time before she died. She had apparently been battling cervical cancer for a number of months, and as was kind of the social norms of the time, they had not told Charles that his mother was sick and near death. They had sort of kept that secret. That was absolutely devastating to him. He goes to Europe. He is part of the security forces that helped to liberate Dachau. He sees incredible things, terrible things, and he comes back home a young man in search of meaning because his mother's gone. He has seen these horrors. His father has remarried, and he's having a hard time processing that as well. And so he's looking for some place to find meaning. Well, the only person he knew that might have an answer was the minister that had done his mother's funeral before he'd left. So he reaches out to the minister, and the minister directs him to a young college Bible study. So he starts meeting with these students, and he says it's during this time that he says, in his words, I accepted God in gratitude. I was just so thankful to finally feel like there was someone there for me in the universe. And so he becomes very religious, very involved. The church that he gets involved with is a small church out of Indiana. It's called the Church of God of Anderson, Indiana. Today, Anderson University in Indiana is sort of the continuing home of this small denomination. And Schultz, for years, aside from where his work in Peanuts, writes Christian comic strip for the publications for the church. He does it for free, pro bono, because he wants to support that ministry. He secretly, privately funded a number of different facilities, including an arts center at Anderson University, to kind of further their Christian mission there. In Peanuts, we do see Charles Schultz's faith come alive, most importantly in the character of Linus. Linus is this sort of junior theologian who will bring these obscure passages from the Old Testament or from the New Testament and make reference to these, or sort of, go on these great diatribes. One case in particular is when there's a scene where Linus and Lucy are looking out the window from their house. It's pouring down rain, and Lucy says, "Oh, it's raining so hard. I'm afraid the whole world's going to flood." And Linus says, "Well, actually, God told Noah after the flood that God promised Noah that he would never flood the earth again." And Lucy says, thank you. That makes me feel much better. And Linus says, good theology will do that for you. But of course, the most classic example of Charles Schultz's faith in Peanuts is the Charlie Brown Christmas special, right? Charlie Brown Christmas, the entire program, Charlie Brown is pleading for the answer to what is the meaning of Christmas. What is all of this really about? We do all this stuff and all these decorations and all these lights and all the flash and presents and pomp and circumstance, but what is it really all about? And case after case, Charlie Brown is disappointed. He doesn't find an answer until finally they're preparing for their school Christmas pageant. And Charlie Brown in frustration says, doesn't anybody know what the meaning of Christmas is? Can anybody tell me? And Linus says, I can help you, Charlie Brown. Walks out onto the stage, the lights go dark and a spotlight goes up on Linus, and Linus recites the nativity narrative from Luke chapter 2. Now, this whole scene was very concerning to Charles Schultz co-writers on the program, and it was very concerning to the executives who were producing this, CBS and Coca-Cola, who was the commercial sponsor for this program. When they saw this in the final screening weeks before it was to air, they were very nervous about being so blatant with this message. And here again is another place where we see Charles Schultz, typically timid, typically pretty go with the flow, Charles Schulz stands up and says, look, if we don't say this, if we don't say that Christmas is about this historic person of great consequence, Jesus of Nazareth, if we don't say that, who's going to say it, right? And again, we see in this period, what was happening in media when it came to religion was something very similar to what was happening in dealing with race, was that there was a sense that you didn't ever want to get too specific. You always wanted to keep religion very vague. You could talk about faith, you could talk about praying, but you never wanted to get specific about beliefs, because then you got into conflicts between denominations and between faiths, between Christianity and Judaism and other things. And so they just wanted to stay clear of this. The incredible thing was the morning after the show, the special ran, it ran, and it was the second highest rated program that night in prime time. The only show that beat it out was Bonanza, and Bonanza was the end all be all of television of the 60s at that point. It gets huge numbers, and the next day, CBS, United Feature Syndicate, Coca-Cola, and Charles Schulz office all get flooded with postcards and letters from all over the country, people saying, thank you for saying something that I've never seen anyone else on TV say, getting to the heart of what Christmas is about. Now, there were just as many folks, so there was a subset of very religious Christian, we might today call them evangelicals, who saw this as sort of a great win for their faith in pop culture. But there were just as many people who watched that program and did not take a religious message from it, but instead took the message of anti-consumerism, right? The moment that touches them is Charlie Brown with the scraggly little tree, right? The Charlie Brown Christmas tree at the end, and choosing to, it's not the prettiest, it's not the greatest, but it's our tree, right? And we give it meaning and we make it special. And so together it brings them all together. And that
polysemi.
Yeah, exactly. He was doing it again. He was doing it again in the TV special.
So one last question from me before I open it up for questions from the audience. Dr. Ball, you have read and studied more about Charles Schulz and Peanuts than probably anybody alive. I think I can just say definitely anybody alive. Who is your favorite Peanuts character and why?
You saved the hardest question for last. Oh man. Well, if I could only pick one, I would say Linus. Although I'm very much a Charlie Brown sometimes. I don't want to be, but sometimes I can be the hopeless loser. But I identify with Linus, and Linus in particular. One, because Linus is always the one that when someone, the other kids are having fun, or they've got some kind of fun idea, or they want to make a joke, and Linus turns everything super serious, right? Super serious and philosophical and theological and just deep. And my friends, when I was in college, used to always give me a hard time because I was kind of that one in the group who would, somebody, did you see that silly commercial? I'm like, yeah. And it made me think about how they're representing this, and and I'm like, oh my gosh,
you were the Linus of the group.
I was the Linus of the group. So I identify with Linus.
Fair enough. I'm going to turn things over to Megan to channel questions from the audience. So I'll go ahead and mute myself and hand things over.
Awesome. And so far, I'll give everybody a moment, but we do have Kimberly Batty Herbert. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. So she had commented that this is so insightful and that she has a whole new appreciation and respect for Charles Schulz. But then she also asked, what is the background? Is there a background for Pigpen?
Oh, Pigpen. Yeah. So Pigpen shows up in the 1950s, and Pigpen is sort of, in a way, he sort of precedes that sort of immovable kind of confidence that Peppermint Patty would sometimes have. All the other kids are very concerned about why is this kid so messy and dirty, and he he doesn't seem to care at all. Now I have wondered, and this is just me theorizing, having read it and kind of thinking about what's going on at the time. There was a lot of conversation in the 1950s about um, urban decay. There was real concern in the 1950s about the state of the state of um, uh, chi- um, children and schools in urban cities, about the quality of parenting in some of the urban communities. And so there was, I always wondered if Pigpen is some sort of reflection on the concern about urban children. But there again, and Schultz is so good at doing this. He has something that could potentially be sort of a criticism, but he flips it around, and Pigpen says, "No, I'm fine. I'm well adjusted and perfectly happy." So
That's awesome. This has been fascinating. I had no idea that a cute little comic strip could carry so much weight behind it. And the stories and the background are just absolutely fantastic. Oh, and we do have one more question. Nathan wants to know, was there anything about the phrase good grief that Schultz commented on or on why he chose it?
oh, um, that's a good question. He never talks specifically about. Well, the one way that comes up is uh, interviewers that would talk to Charles Schultz and spend any time with him. They would often remark that if you spend time with Charles Schultz, you very quickly begin to see that the way the children talk is exactly the way he talks. He was adamant about not cursing or using slanders or anything like that, and so instead he would use these euphemisms like "good grief" and and all of these. There was another saying that Charlie Brown had a whole lot in the 50s and kind of died out over time, but it was sort of this again kind of existential punchline of a number of the strips when he would say, "Well, that's just the way it is, right? Like that's life, can't change it." But he's always definitely had that kind of attitude.
And we have, and I'm gonna, since we are just about at 6:30, I will put out this other question here, but for all the history students who joined us tonight as part of Dr. Hernando's class, just so you know, I am gonna make sure that he gets our list of attendees tonight, so you don't have to worry about letting him know that you joined us, because he will know. So, and then with that, I will jump onto this last question. Cameron wants to know, what is the significance of Snoopy's war flashbacks from when he was a pilot?
Oh, okay. Well, I could talk about this one for a very long time. I would encourage you, if this is by far the chapter of my book that I've gotten the most feedback from all kinds of different folks, but especially from war veterans, both Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan. But I have a chapter in which I break down the introduction of Snoopy as the World War I flying ace fighting the Red Baron in a constantly losing battle. He always gets shot down. He's always falling behind enemy lines. This comes out right on the heels of the escalation of the Vietnam War in 1965. And the two become so closely connected in sort of comments by the, Snoopy has this constant refrain of, curse you, Red Baron, I'll get you next time. But by 68 and 69, curse you, Red Baron has become curse this stupid war. Are we ever going to get to go back home again? Right. And then by 1970, things have gotten so serious that Charles Schulz stops writing Snoopy as the flying ace altogether. And a lot of fans write about this because this was a very popular sort of storyline in the strip. And Schultz's response was, the real life war is becoming so terrible that it's just not a fitting topic for the comic strip anymore. But if you want to read more about that, I go into the full detail of how you can see the development of the Vietnam quagmire and how Schulz is commenting on this through Snoopy's war with the Red Baron.
It's good to know. And I will make sure that the link to your book is included in the email that goes out to everybody. I know it's going on my wish list now because there's so much that I can learn from this. This is great.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, and we appreciate your time so much, Dr. Ball. Dr. Hernando, thank you for your time as well, for being with us tonight to facilitate this whole thing. We really appreciate it. This was a wonderful evening. And
thank you.
Yeah, I hope everybody has a wonderful night. And
yes.
We will see you in February for our next Comet Talk, which I will also include in my email. Have a wonderful night, everybody.
Good night.